Hello, everyone. My name is Lasha Tsatawa. I'm one of the co-founders of Saperica, a nonprofit organization. And our mission statement is to promote Saperavi and other Georgian grape varieties, along with Georgian gastronomy and culture in Finger Lakes, New York, and around US by organizing and facilitating educational seminars and exchange programs between the regions for wine and culinary industry professionals and enthusiasts. Today, we will be presenting to you the presentation, Flavors of Georgia.
So this presentation is in conjunction with our first major event, which is the first annual Saperavi Festival, taking place in the Finger Lakes region of New York on Saturday, May 14th. And this festival is a collection of producers of Saperavi from the Finger Lakes, from Georgia, and from other areas in the United States. And it's also tying in the celebration of Georgian gastronomy and culture. So today, as part of our series connected with the Saperavi Festival, we have one of our guest speakers for the festival, who is an expert on gastronomy. So I will introduce you to Darra Goldstein, who is the author of The Georgian Feast, The Vibrant Culture and Savory Food of the Republic of Georgia. This is a book and cookbook that has recently celebrated its 25th anniversary. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction to Ms. Goldstein before we continue with her presentation. Darra Goldstein is the founding editor of the journal Gastronomica and the author of 6 award-winning cookbooks, including The Georgian Feast, which won the 1994 IACP Julia Child Award for Cookbook of the Year. Darra has consulted for the Council of Europe on using food as a tool for tolerance and diversity, and has held distinguished fellowships in food studies at the University of Toronto and the University of Melbourne. She currently sits on the board of the Julia Child Foundation for Gastronomy and the Culinary Arts, and is a member of the advisory kitchen cabinet of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. In 2020, she received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Association of Culinary Professionals. And it is our pleasure to welcome Darra, giving her presentation on the flavors of Georgia.
Thank you so much, Erica and Lasha. It is really a pleasure to be here today to talk about something I love so deeply, namely Georgia and Georgian food and Georgian wine. I want to give you just an overview of this culinary culture, which stretches back thousands of years. As you've heard, winemaking in Georgia is an astonishing 8,000 years old, and with wine comes food. And I wanted to start with this beautiful painting by the Georgian primitivist Nico Pirosmani, who painted at the turn of the 20th century. He is showing a Georgian supra or feast, and significantly, it's outdoors because the Georgians love to eat outside in their beautiful landscape. And one of the creation myths of Georgia is that the Georgians were sitting around drinking wine and feasting, as they love to do, when God was divvying up the world and people had to decide where they would live. And they were so engrossed in their meal and singing praises to God that they missed the deadline. And on his way back from having handed out the entire world to different peoples, God saw that they were still at the table drinking and eating, and he chided them and said, "You've missed the deadline. Now there's nothing left for you." And they said, but Lord, we have been singing your praises about this beautiful land and its wine and food, and we've spent our time well. And he was so impressed that he decided to give them the very last piece of land that was remaining that he had been saving for himself. And that's how the Georgians came to live in paradise. And paradise it is. You'll see very prominently that they are toasting. They don't usually toast with a fish. More often it's with wine horns or with wine glasses. On either side of the table, you see the kvevri, which are these wonderful clay amphorae that are the traditional method of aging wine in Georgia. And they're not usually sitting right at the table, but they're such an important iconic sign of winemaking and the whole culture of food and wine in Georgia, as is the wineskin at the front of the table. Leaning against the kvevri, you can see swadi, which are shish kebabs of grilled meat. And you can see some slipper-shaped bread on the table and all kinds of other things. Just to put the kvevri in context, I thought I'd show you this very funny picture of me from 1989 on a trip to Georgia under a pergola of grapevines. I'm 5'3", and the kvevri is considerably larger than I am. They come in all different sizes and have different applications. But this clay that they're made from is very important to give the wine the ultimate flavor it has. And the clay is also used to make cooking vessels. So today we're going to taste a range of wines, as you have heard, made from the Saperavi grape. And this name of the grape comes from the word meaning to dye, to add color to. And what's extraordinary about this grape, unlike most red wine grapes, is that it's red all the way through, a kind of purple. And so the wine is this beautiful, deep, rich color. And what does it go with? Well, I drink red wine with anything, but it lends itself especially well to Georgian flavors. So here you see some requisite components of a Georgian feast. In the foreground, you have these shoti, which are the traditional Georgian bread. And I'll show you in a moment how those are made. To the right, you have the khachapuri, which is also known as the Georgian pizza. It's basically a skillet bread, although sometimes it's made in the oven, but it's filled with a very rich cow's milk cheese. To the left, you see the Georgian dumplings known as khinkali. You see grilled meat. You see wonderful vegetable pâtés, and of course, the pitcher of wine, without which a meal is not complete. So the Georgian bread is classically made in a clay oven known as the tonne. It's quite similar to the Indian tandoor. And there are a lot of connections between India and Georgia that really need to be investigated further. But basically, you take the dough and you slap it against the side of the oven, which is very hot, as you can see. And then there's a hook that you use to peel it off once it's done. It's the perfect bread for a happy marriage. My husband and I have been together for almost 42 years. And one of us likes a very crisp crust and the other likes a soft one. And the brilliant thing about shoti, as you can see from the finished loaves, is that you have both in a single loaf. I mentioned the svadi. So the Georgians do cook outside whenever there's an opportunity. They use beef, they use lamb, they use pork, chicken, sturgeon, trout, vegetables. You can really grill anything. The meat is often marinated ahead of time. Pomegranate juice is good to use because it acts as a tenderizer and helps to break down the flavors. But it's not simply the grilling and the delicious taste you get from the charcoal, it also is really recalling the legend of Prometheus, who, as punishment for having given the gift of fire to mankind, was chained to Mount Elbrus, which is in the Caucasus. So even in the simplest of meals, the Georgians reach back to this rich history of legend and mythology that they have. Even when they accepted Christianity in the 4th century, it was Nino who came bearing a cross woven of grapevines. And so the wine and the religion and the food and the feasting are all a very spiritual act for the Georgians.
Darra, do you mind if I add something to
Oh, no,
that
please
last
do.
slide? Is that the swadi is traditionally cooked over the embers of grapevine cuttings. So even in the cooking of this meat, there's a link to the strong culture that Georgia has to the grapevine.
I'm glad you mentioned that. And that gives a very specific taste to it as well. And it makes the whole thing kind of holistic as a culinary experience. With the meat, there are usually condiments served, either adjika, which is ranging from something as firm as a paste to something as liquid as a salsa. It's made from hot peppers and also red bell peppers with a lot of herbs and spices added to give it a distinctive Georgian taste. I'll get into which herbs and spices are very typical later, but it's a beloved accompaniment. My favorite is a plum sauce called tkemali. And this is made from a special sour plum that grows in Georgia. Unfortunately, I don't know anyone who's growing it in the States, but you can take unripe plums, Santa Rosa are quite good. And you can cook them down again with herbs like cilantro is very important in Georgian cooking. You can add some dill, you can add some mint, you can add some basil. You know, it really depends on your own family recipe, and different spices such as coriander, blue fenugreek, and others. And you get this beautiful sour plum sauce that complements the meat very well. You can also add some hot peppers if you want to make it a bit spicy. And Georgia is really only about the size of South Carolina, but it has many different regions. And the western part of Georgia tends to like its food spicy. And in the eastern part of Georgia, which is Kakheti, where most of the wine is grown, grapes are grown throughout the country, but the old wine region in Kakheti, they tend to have fresher food that's not quite as spicy. So here's the khachapuri I was talking about. Most often made quickly in a skillet with a fresh dough that doesn't have to rise. You can use a quick leavener. And it is filled classically with sulguni cheese, a salted cow's milk cheese that's very tasty. You can also make other kinds of these pies that are filled with red kidney beans, as I think we'll have later today, or with different greens or with potatoes. There are a myriad of combinations. When I wrote the Georgian Feast in 1993, a very long time ago, I really wished I could find a benefactor who would open a series of khachapuri stands for me, because I was sure it would become the next pizza. I couldn't find anyone like that. No one really knew about it until people started paying more attention to Georgian food, really because of the natural wines that were coming out of Georgia. So the wine led the way for the food. And then the khachapuri on the right became the Instagram darling and was seen everywhere. It's from a region in Western Georgia known as Ajara. And this type of bread is made with a yeasted dough. And inside it's filled with the cheese. And then when it's done, you crack a raw egg over it. You slide it under the flame again, just to cook the egg slightly, but keep it runny. And then you mix the whole gooey mess into the bread, and you take the bread, break it off, and scoop it up. And it truly is one of the most divine things in the world. Very cholesterol laden, though, I have to add. The Georgians are wizard with dairy. They make beautiful yogurt, particularly from water buffalo. It's known as matsoni. They make extraordinary cheeses, and a very wide range of them. During the Soviet years, there were only about 3 or 4 cheeses made that were sold commercially, and they were pretty bland. And astonishingly, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a very few, really just a handful of people decided to go throughout the remote parts of Georgia to gather information about how all of these old styles of cheeses were made. And now a lot of these have geographical protection. They have won awards. This is one of my favorites. It's made in Tusheti, which is in the Caucasus. It's Tushuri Gouda. And it's a sheep's milk cheese that's made by putting the milk and layering it with rock salt inside a very thoroughly cleaned sheepskin with the woolly part inside. And it's left to sit in the sheepskin that's inflated with air. And then the salt makes these wonderful pock marks. And then after 3 weeks, it's taken out, and it's amazing. The suguni I mentioned for the khachapuri finds many other uses in cooking, especially deliciously when it's mixed with cornmeal to make something called elargi that again has this wonderful comfort food appeal. Khinkali are the Georgian dumplings. They're not tiny. You might know Russian pilmeni. These are about 2 to 3 times as big. And they're distinguished not just by their beautiful pleats, but also by the top knot. They're kind of like Chinese soup dumplings in that they have a lot of wonderful liquid inside, but instead of using a spoon to scoop them up as you would with a Chinese dumpling, you pick them up by the top knot. Preferably the khinkali have been sprinkled liberally with freshly ground pepper, and you hold it by the top knot like this, tip your head back, bite into it so that the juices flow into your mouth and you don't lose anything. And then you don't really eat the top knot, you just set it to the side. They can be filled classically with a mixture of beef and pork, or they can be filled with lamb or mushrooms or greens. So they're also very versatile. I think what makes Georgian cuisine so distinct, though, from the cuisines of its neighbors, say in Turkey or Armenia or Azerbaijan, is its use of walnuts. In the United States, we tend to think of walnuts as something to add to brownies or to add to chocolate chip cookies. We don't really think of walnuts as a savory main course ingredient. But historically, walnuts were pressed for their oil in Georgia. Walnuts are very rich in omega-3s, and that oil was what Georgians used. And they also become very creamy and are thickening agents. So they're used in all kinds of soups and stews. There are wonderful dishes like satsivi, which is turkey or chicken or duck that has been cooled in a walnut sauce. A quicker one known as baja, which is also this beautiful creamy walnut sauce. You can see a stew down the left-hand corner. And on the right, some of the beautiful vegetable pâtés that you'll be tasting. These actually are a picture from Chama Mama. So you'll taste the real thing. You grind walnuts and you mix them with cooked vegetables. And it's really one of the most extraordinarily delicious Georgian dishes. So my favorite might be eggplant, but I love the beet khali, or there's carrots, there are leeks, there's spinach. You can really do with any number of vegetables.
And I'll just quickly add, Dara, here that the use of walnuts and walnut sauce, whether it's with vegetables or bhaji or satsivi, as you mentioned, it's a perfect pairing with skin contact whites from either Western or Eastern Georgia. So that's one of the classic pairing dishes in Georgian cuisine.
That's excellent. I'm glad you mentioned that, especially because, well, with the Georgian feast, you don't have this parade of courses that are very strictly defined like you do, say, in American or European dining. It's not like you start with the hors d'oeuvres and then the appetizers and then the soup and then the entree. Everything sort of comes at once, but the phali is always on the table at the beginning, even if other foods are brought in and piled high. And so it's one of the first things that you would eat at a Georgian feast, because they're served at room temperature. You don't have to make sure that it's piping hot from the kitchen. Another classic Georgian dish is lobio, which are stewed beans, usually kidney beans. And most often walnuts are mixed in, ground walnuts, although not always, and lots of different herbs and spices, and cilantro being predominant. You can see that once again, we have this beautiful red clay that if you bake the beans in this, in a wood burning oven, they take on an extraordinarily mellow taste that you don't get from simmering on the stovetop. In Western Georgia, they're classically served with these cornmeal cakes known as jadi that are quite good. And the two pair a very nice balance of corn and beans, you know, two of the three sisters in Central American cooking. The corn in Georgia displaced millet. Millet was the classic crop that was grown, but when corn was introduced in the 18th century, it became favored, as it did throughout most of Europe. So I've mentioned a lot of really rich, hearty, filling foods. And as you can imagine, you might want to balance them with something a little piquant. In addition to the adika, the hot sauce, or the kamali, the plum sauce. And the Georgians have a wonderful array of pickles. They especially like to pickle whole heads of garlic, either just in a white wine vinegar or adding some beet juice to it, or red wine vinegar, so that they take on this beautiful garnet color. Cabbage is also done this way. Often whole heads of cabbages are immersed in the brine so that they come out looking like a beautiful pink rose. And my favorite Georgian pickle is known as janjoli, which is the flowering buds of a plant, Staphyleia cochica, which is cocos bladdernut. Cocos is the ancient Greek term for the western part of Georgia. That's where Jason sought the golden fleece, and where Medea worked her magic or her evil or her medicine, or however you want to think about her. But a very common Georgian name still today is Medea. And so in Georgia and in Georgian food, you somehow encounter all the myths of the past that are still present in the bite of the food. The classic spice mixture in Georgia is known as khmeli suneli, which simply means mixed spices. And just like curry powder, which is a combination of spices, the khmeli suneli can come in any number of combinations of ingredients depending on what dish you want to add it to. So classically, it will look golden, but it can be brown, it can be redder. What makes it this beautiful color is a crucial Georgian ingredient known as Imeretian saffron, which is none other than the dried petals of marigold. And they give the Georgian food just besides a beautiful hue, this wonderfully earthy flavor. And in this mix, you also get dried mint, dried blue fenugreek, basil, dill, coriander seed, sometimes caraway is added. You can add some dried parsley, you can add some basil. It's really up to the cook, but it's tremendously aromatic, and it's easy enough to find these days. When I was writing my book, it was impossible, but it's all over the internet now, so you can try Georgian flavors at home. And on a Georgian feast table, you will also have, in addition to these very full flavored foods, always have a platter of fresh herbs and fresh greens. In a certain way, Georgia is this wonderful, Georgian food is this wonderful combination of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern. Middle Eastern in its very deft use of spices, and Mediterranean in its love for fresh greens and fresh fruits and vegetables. So I want to close with just a couple of slides showing how integrated winemaking is into the larger Georgian meal. And here's one of my favorite Georgian treats. It's known as tortilla. And the Georgians aren't big on dessert per se. There are a lot of sweet things. There are a lot of wonderfully sweet fruits. There are a lot of confections that are made with walnuts and also with grape juice, as we see here, but not so much a huge repertoire of baked goods. And these are made usually with walnuts, but also with hazelnuts, which Georgia has quite a thriving hazelnut growing industry. And the grape juice is thickened with cornstarch, and you string the nuts on these pieces of string, and then you dip them repeatedly into the grape juice. And you can see that after a while, you have to let it dry a little bit, and then you dip it again until it builds up about, I don't know, maybe 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch of what tastes a little bit like fruit leather. But it all depends on the wine or the grapes that you start with and the juice that is pressed from them. You get this marvelous array of colors, and they all taste slightly differently. And it's fun. It's a good travel food because it doesn't spoil. You can just take it and cut off a piece, and it's like an energy bar. It's the original energy bar, I would say. And then arguably my favorite Georgian dessert is something called belamushi, which is very unusual. You take freshly pressed grape juice and you boil it down into a concentrate known as badagi. And it's sort of like, I don't know, for lack of a better comparison, Manischewitz wine, I mean, it's really very, very sweet. And you mix this with very fine cornmeal and add a little bit of cornstarch, and it thickens into this beautiful pudding that is just kind of divine. And to me, it captures all of the flavors of Georgia, because at the end of the meal, you are tasting the wine that has accompanied you throughout the meal. So in thinking about the Finger Lakes and Georgian food, it occurs to me that there are many ways in which the two can go hand in hand. There is an organization that you'll see on the lower right here called Finger Lakes Farm Country, and they're promoting not only the growing of grapes in this region, but also all different types of fruits and vegetables, because the soil is very fertile. So how can you bring a Georgian taste to the food in the Finger Lakes? Well, the oil that is most often used in Georgian cooking today is sunflower seed oil. And I know that the image is pretty small here, but this is roasted sunflower seed oil from Georgia that is cold pressed, and it's really quite divine. In the Finger Lakes, there's a company called Stony Brook Wholehearted Foods, and they also make an organic sunflower oil and also a butternut squash seed oil, which has that same wonderfully nutty quality. So you can cook with that instead of using olive oil or instead of using canola oil. Cornell has experimental orchards that are world famous. They have 22 acres of apples alone, and apples are beloved in Georgian cuisine. Here you see bashlebi, which are apple dumplings. The Seneca Grains and Beans is doing an amazing job of growing organic beans, kidney beans, and all other kinds of beans. You can use them in Lobio, but also heritage wheat. And Georgia has some of the most important landrace wheats that there are. And there's an organization called Elkanah that is working very hard to start growing them more broadly commercially. And in fact, some of these wheats have now been listed by UNESCO as part of the intangible cultural heritage. So Georgian wheat is something to think about and see perhaps if it can thrive in the Finger Lakes. The duck is something I'm hoping someone in the audience will pick up on, because there used to be very popular in the 19th century, the most widely eaten duck in America that was raised as opposed to being a wild duck was the Cayuga duck that you see here in this picture. It was introduced to the Finger Lakes in 1840, and that's how it got its name, Cayuga. And what was remarkable about it was it had big fleshy breast, and the meat, I have never tasted it, but the meat was favored by everyone. It was sold in all the best restaurants like Delmonico's in New York City. And it was only in the 1890s when the Peking duck was introduced to Long Island that the Cayuga duck fell out of favor, and the Peking duck became the one that then became known as Long Island duck. And the reason it became more popular was not because its flavor was better, it wasn't, but because it had white feathers. The Cayuga duck has black feathers, and so it's very hard to clean and make sure that the meat doesn't have these little pin feathers. But I really hope that someone will bring it back, and then you can make dishes like this duck kalya that we'll taste later today, which is braised duck in a pomegranate sauce. Or another classic Georgian preparation is duck with a blackberry sauce. So again, you have these acidic fruits like pomegranates and blackberries that counteract the richness of the duck. There is amazing trout in the Finger Lakes, as there is in Georgia. And I've already mentioned the beef and pork that go into the mtswadi. And a lot of good organic beef and pork is being raised here. So I hope that this has given you a little bit of insight into the flavors of Georgia. I'm sorry that technology has not advanced far enough to send out smells and flavors through the ether, but luckily those of you who will be at the festival in person will be able to taste them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darra. This was an amazing presentation. Thank you.
Do you want me to advance to the next slide?
Please,
Okay.
Erica.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Darra. That was a wonderful introduction to Georgia, and also, you know, makes us salivate for things that could come to cuisine in the Finger Lakes to pair with the Finger Lakes Saperavi that's being produced, and throughout the United States too. Just the Georgian food culture is starting to grow, and I think this definitely will give us and our participants a lot of ideas and a lot of things to think about as far as the gastronomy and the food and wine pairing are concerned. And stay tuned. We will be continuing with more gastronomy seminars in the future after the festival. So we look forward to seeing more of Darra, and also seeing as many of you as possible at the festival and future Saperica events. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we need to stop. the
Yes,
recording.
I'm doing that now.